Good afternoon. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy days to join us this afternoon. My name is Clyde Kaufman, and I'm Chief Operating Officer of Underwriters Laboratories, Inc. And it's really my pleasure and honor today to introduce this distinguished group of ambassadors to the countries of Indonesia, Philippines, Malaysia, and Vietnam, as well as introduce the President and CEO of the US-ASEAN Business Council. For those of you who've yet to be familiar with UL, it's our mission to promote safe living and working environments all across the world. And we do so through standards development, safety science research, and education and outreach. And we will continue to work hard every day to work collaboratively with the ASEAN Business Council as it continues to take the next step forward in the global economy. I was talking to Ambassador Blake at lunch today, and it reminded me of a story from Bob Galvin, who you all know was one of the founding members of Motorola and passed away a few years ago. He shared with his story in the late 80s where he and his two sons, Chris and Mike Galvin, went to go visit China. And he described an environment where all the different corporations were on the ground there with their jets, and they stayed for maybe 1 or 2 hours and they left. And Bob decided to take his family into the country. He lived with local folks for 2 weeks. And that stuck with the local government and the local folks. They were able to earn privileges and opportunities to do business for years to come that others could never get. And so I encourage all of you who've yet to have the opportunity to visit Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, or the Philippines to do so. Spend time there. Make it an important trip. We invest in those communities. We've doubled our revenue there in the last couple of years and quadrupled the number of people. And I think it's hard to really understand the issues that are going on unless you spend time in the community and walk in their shoes. We had a great start to the roundtable earlier before this lunch, and we talked about issues. And my takeaway when you think about global cities and smart cities is really that safety is nuance. Cities are nuanced, and you really have to understand what the unique challenges and priorities are as opposed to taking just a Western view. But the other most important thing was we all agreed that there's tremendous opportunities and learnings to share best practices, to talk about what's working, what's not working. And that's what this forum's all about. So please bring your questions. Ask anything on your mind, and let's share what we've started here in Chicago on global cities, and let's engage in a great conversation. So let me introduce the folks who will come up here before us. You have their full bios of each of these folks, so I'll only introduce them by their current posting. First, from Indonesia, is the Honorable Robert O. Blake, Jr., who's been with us since November 2013. Next is the Honorable Philip S. Goldberg to the Philippines, Ambassador since November 2013. The Honorable Ted Osius has served as a U.S. Ambassador to Vietnam since November 2014. And the Honorable Joseph Y. Yoon has served as Ambassador to Malaysia since September 2013. Today's panel will be moderated by Alexander Feldman, who's been the President and CEO of the US-ASEAN Business Council since 2009. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished guests. Please come up. Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Alex Feldman. As Clyde introduced me, I'm the President and CEO of the US-ASEAN Business Council, and we're very grateful for the Chicago Council to host this distinguished group of American ambassadors to Southeast Asia. I also want to thank UL for their sponsorship of today's event, but also for their leadership in the US-ASEAN Business Council. Keith Williams has been our vice chairman for the last several years and will become our chairman on January 1st of 2016. So we're excited for UL's leadership and appreciate, Clyde, your warm welcome. The US-ASEAN Business Council is a 32-year-old organization that's been helping American business in Southeast Asia grow as our single and only mission. Today we represent over 150 American companies doing business in Southeast Asia, many of whose executives are in this room today, so we're grateful for your membership. ASEAN, for those of you who don't know, as was referenced in the beginning, is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and it's basically, from a geographic point, all the countries nestled between China and India. It's the fourth largest export market for the United States collectively. Over $100 billion of U.S. goods go to Southeast Asia a year. Illinois has a huge stake in ASEAN. Over $4 billion in goods and services go to ASEAN each year from this great state. We've got the #1 destination of American investment anywhere in Asia. Over $200 billion has been invested in Southeast Asia. And to put that in a little bit of perspective, that's more, according to the U.S. Trade Representative, than the U.S. has invested in India, China, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and New Zealand combined. So Southeast Asia, although you may not think of it in the same breath as you think about India or China, is incredibly important to American business. And we, since 1992, have been bringing U.S. ambassadors posted to the ASEAN countries back to the United States to try and make sure that folks outside of the Beltway in Washington know a little bit about what's going on in Southeast Asia, and hopefully you'll all come and visit, as Clyde suggested, or invest or do business. We've got a great story in Southeast Asia, and I'm really honored to have our 4 ambassadors with us this afternoon. What I've asked each of them to do is in 2 or 3 minutes, because we've got only about 20 minutes of time, to go through some of the chief issues from an economic, political, geopolitical range. I will say that President Obama will be in the Philippines, as he was last year, and in Malaysia, as he was last year, for meetings in November. The Philippines is hosting APEC, and Malaysia is the chair of ASEAN, and the president will be in for the APEC and ASEAN meetings. He may, we hope, go to Vietnam, but that is not something that we can announce here or confirm. But I'd love to just start with Ambassador Yoon and go down the line, and then hopefully have some opportunity to hear from you.
Well, thanks very much, Alex, and thank you for the Chicago Council for having us here, and many of you for being here. I don't know, how many of you have been to Malaysia? Hands up. That's kind of few. I mean, a lot, you know. I'm surprised, I must say, you know.
That's your 2 minutes, Joe.
Yeah. I've been there 2 years, and it's been much busier than I would have thought. Number one, there were, as you know, 2 very unfortunate air crashes, and that really has made my work and our embassy's work quite busy. Second, is really Malaysia is chair of ASEAN this year. New ASEAN is not what you used to know. It is actually much more dynamic. By the end of this year, it will have moved to ASEAN Economic Community. That is significant. We talked about earlier in the day about having a single market, and their next step is going to be harmonization. Starting from customs and moving up, there will be harmonization issues. Before going to Malaysia, I did follow Southeast Asian issues very closely from Washington for 4 years. But still, several things have surprised me about Malaysia. Number one is, I would say, how economically advanced it is. It is, per capita income is about $10,000. So it's really what I would call upper mid-level income country. And the infrastructure you see there, it's very good. I drove from one tip of Malaysia to another to north, and really excellent highways, excellent infrastructure. The second thing that struck me is that politically it is still, I would say, struggling with many issues. It's been despite the fact that They've had regular elections. It's been a one-party state ruled by UMNO. And I don't know how many of you follow the current affairs, but really the current UMNO head, Prime Minister Najib, seems to be in great difficulty as a result of financial scandal. We have tried a lot over the past, I would say, 6 years to elevate the relationship between US and Malaysia. President Obama will make another trip this year. Prime Minister Najib has been to Washington several times. And this is pretty much in line with everyone here. That is the importance of Southeast Asia. Importance is obvious. Strategically, we're in competition as well as cooperation with China, and that competition is quite severe in what's called South China Sea. So that's going to continue to be an issue. Economically, along with Vietnam, Brunei, Singapore, among ASEAN countries, we will be completing a free trade agreement, TPP, which is 12 countries. Right now, the meetings are going on in Atlanta. And I think that will really open markets for everyone, especially in markets that are formally closed. Things like government procurement market, which in a lot of these countries is over 30% of GDP. So that's a significant boost for these countries. Alex, let me quit there, and then if there are questions, happy to answer them.
Thank you, Ambassador Yoon. Ambassador Osius?
Thanks.
Vietnam, also a TPP country?
That's right. Thanks very much to all of you for hosting us today. I feel lucky to be in Vietnam right now because the relationship with the United States really is surging. There are 16 members of Vietnam's Politburo, the highest ruling body, and 8 of the 16 have visited the United States this year. We've had 5 cabinet level visits, and we're still hoping for a presidential visit. The Vietnamese love high-level visits, and they love anniversaries. And this is the 20th anniversary of the normalization of relations. And so we've used these high-level visits and this important anniversary to move forward in a number of areas. Top of our list is deepening the economic partnership. And as Joe mentioned, we have a tremendous tool for doing that with the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And I haven't seen anything like the unity of effort that is represented by the Vietnamese government when it comes to TPP. Vietnam is the least developed of the 12 economies that's part of TPP, so economically it stands to benefit the most, but it will also be the hardest for Vietnam in many ways to comply with a very high standard trade agreement. It's hard in the area of labor, for example, for the Vietnamese to meet all the standards that are set, but they're determined, absolutely determined to do it. For strategic as well as economic reasons. They don't want to be owned by the neighbor to the north. They are looking to us for options. They're looking to us for strategic options. They also are interested in developing a relationship that isn't just bilateral, but where we work together on issues that have regional and global significance. For example, health. We've been investing over the years in health collaboration with Vietnam, and by working with the Vietnamese to prevent the spread of infectious disease, we're benefiting the region and the world. The Vietnamese have decided to join peacekeeping efforts. That's another way they want to move beyond just bilateral to regional and global collaboration. We're working together on climate change through new technologies that allow climate-friendly agriculture and cleaner energy to be produced to fuel a growing economy. We're working together on rule of law and human rights. And it may be surprising, but the Vietnamese actually have welcomed our input as they revise a lot of their new laws to comply with the 2013 Constitution. And an area that has been very difficult in the past is now increasingly an area where we're able to collaborate. And we have a nascent security relationship with the Vietnamese, partly prompted by the fact that the Chinese were very aggressive last year in the South China Sea and placed an oil rig in waters that Vietnam considers to be its territorial waters. So in a lot of areas, it's surprising how open the Vietnamese are to a relationship with the United States, how eager they are to develop that relationship. I mentioned to colleagues earlier that 92% of Vietnamese, whether young, old, north, south, support a stronger relationship with the United States and consider the United States their country's best friend. That's a long way to have traveled in a very short time.
One of the things, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit, but on education,
And
we've also done a lot, and more Vietnamese are studying here, I think, than ever.
When I first went to Vietnam, there were about 700 students per year going to the United States. Now there are 17,000. And this year we're launching a new university, Fulbright University, Vietnam, partly supported by the US Congress, but partly by American companies. And it will be the first not-for-profit, merit-based US-style university in Vietnam. And the ambitions are very high to make it the best new university in the world. And we have partners in Loyola, UC Irvine, and Arizona State University.
Fantastic, thank you. Ambassador Goldberg, the Philippines is one of our oldest allies.
It is. And thank you to UL and the Chicago Council, our former colleague, Ivo Dalder. And there is a connection between the Philippines and Chicago that some of you may know about, and that is that Daniel Burnham played a key role in designing Manila and the summer capital in Baguio. So I can't say the two look the same. The Philippines had been known just a few years ago as the kind of sick man of Asia economically, and nobody says that anymore. There's a new kind of dynamism taking place with good growth rates, 7% or more in 2013. This year it'll be a little less given the world economic slowdown, but it's still in the 5.5% range. Not all of that growth is necessarily well-placed to be sustainable or inclusive, since so much of it relies still on remittances from abroad, the 10 million Filipinos who live overseas and remit money to family, and call centers, which is the big growth area in terms of employment. In fact, Convergys is the largest private employer in the Philippines. The growth that's going on, though, is also based on the 5 years so far of the Aquino government, which has taken on corruption, done more to try to modernize governance, and is making a mark in both those areas. There is an election next year where part of the theme in the election campaign will be whether to keep that movement forward in what the administration calls the straight path. You might imagine from that and the kinds of things that the Philippines is doing that our relationship is actually at a high point. It sort of went into disrepair a bit after the American bases closed in 1991. But we are doing a lot more across the board, economically, of course, but also in the military and strategic areas. Ted mentioned the South China Sea. The Philippines has taken a very principled position and has done a very American thing. They're suing the Chinese. And they brought them to the International Tribunal under the law of the sea. And that case is ongoing. The United States doesn't have a position on the various claims, but is certainly supportive of legal, diplomatic, and peaceful means of settling disputes. Also about behavior in the area and freedom of navigation. So the United States and the Philippines, I think if you think in terms of the rebalance that the Obama administration set out to achieve, is actually a prime example of what can be accomplished. Because in the defense area, in our political relationship, in our economic relationship, we're doing quite well. So with that, move on.
Thank you. Indonesia is the largest country in Southeast Asia. Ambassador Blake.
Let me add my own warm thanks to EVO and Chicago Council and to UL. Indonesia, for those of you who don't know very much about the country, is a country of growing strategic importance to the United States. It's the largest Muslim majority democracy in the world now. It's a country that has averaged growth rates of 5% or more over the last 10 years. And it's a country that made a very important transition after the crisis of 1998, the Asian financial crisis, and really embraced democracy and a market economy in a way that right now is very, very important, because we're working with Indonesia to try to share a lot of those lessons with countries in the Middle East, with countries like Myanmar, who are kind of teetering on that very edge right now and trying to decide which way to go. So their advice, I think, is very, very relevant and important in this day and age. Many of you know Indonesia had an important election last year. President Jokowi was elected, a new breed of politician in Indonesia, the first man not to be either a military general or somebody from the traditional political elites, but a small-town mayor and somebody who is very much committed to good governance, which was probably the key election issue. He's made increasing growth. It's currently about 4.5%. He wants to get up to about 7%, but also a reduction of poverty. About 40% of the country is still living on less than $2 a day. He's trying to do that first by a huge investment in infrastructure of all kinds, but also by developing what he calls the maritime axis to better integrate the 6,000 islands on which that are inhabited islands in Indonesia. All of that makes great sense. We're supporting various aspects of that. President Obama will be receiving President Jokowi on October 26th, in about a month from now. The key issues in our relationship first are economic. We have about $28 billion of trade, but obviously there's much room for growth in that area. American investors have probably been the largest investors over the last 10 years or so. Originally only in oil and gas and mining, but increasingly now in pretty much every area that you can think of, increasingly focused on consumer goods because of the growing middle class in Indonesia. Climate change is also a very important area of cooperation, because Indonesia is one of the largest greenhouse gas emitters in the world, because of the large amount of tropical forests that have been cleared over the last 20 or 25 years, but also increasingly because of their very heavy reliance on fossil fuels. So we're playing a very important role in helping to catalyze investments in renewable energy, but also helping to encourage more sustainable forest management practices. We also have a growing defense relationship. We are by far their largest bilateral exercise partner. We're selling increasingly sophisticated weapon systems of various kinds. And I think the Indonesians strategically see us as a very important counterweight to the Chinese. The Chinese are very, very active economically, particularly. And again, I think the Indonesians want to see a balance between the Chinese economic outreach and that from the United States and Japan and Korea. So we still have wonderful opportunities to do much more in all of those areas. When President Obama sees Jokowi, I think mostly the conversation is going to be strategic, talking about things like how do we do more to counter violent extremism, how do we do more to combat climate change, how can we work more closely together in the South China Sea to support ASEAN efforts, and some of those very, very big issues. But we welcome all of you coming to visit. Again, I think there's so many opportunities for American companies, and I'm glad to talk to any of you after the meeting. Thank you.
Now we've got actually a little bit of time. We probably have 15, 20 minutes to at least to take questions from all of you. So I hope this has stimulated some areas of thought, and hopefully, whether it's economics, education, politics, Southeast Asia's got it all. So I hope you'll engage these ambassadors on how we're doing. As I mentioned in the beginning, it's an incredibly young part of the world. I've seen one study that even by 2050, 50% of Southeast Asia's overall population will still be under 30 years old. of age. And today that percentage is even higher. So.
Okay, Alex just got to ask them for their bio, so we've got to show him a tough counsel, a few questions for ASEAN. We'll start up right here, please, the lady at the second table. Could you wait for the mic, please? Thanks.
Hi. I'm very interested in all of your presentations. I know that a barrier for businesses, particularly U.S. businesses, in particularly Malaysia and Indonesia, and to some extent the Philippines, I don't know about Vietnam, is corruption. Can you talk about what the U.S. can do, if anything, to help those countries with that issue, to help business, to encourage business investment?
Great topic. Sure, please.
Sure. Well, as I said, President Jacoby is very much committed to this. He himself is trying to use things like putting as much stuff online now to take decision making out of bureaucrats as much as possible. But we are working a lot to basically build up institutions that are working to stop corruption. So the most famous of those is the Corruption Eradication Commission in Indonesia, but also the Auditing Board, the various equivalents of inspectors general within the ministries. We have a very active program of procurement reform to help with public procurement. So there's a pretty wide range of efforts that we have underway, both through the U.S. Agency for International Development, as well as through the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which is a large program that we have underway. And again, a very important aspect of that is procurement modernization.
I would echo what Bob said in terms of what we're doing through USAID programs. We're doing a lot of different programs in the judicial area to try to cut down on corruption in the judicial sector. We work within the Customs Bureau to try to cut down opportunities there. I'll give you a small example. In the city of Makati, which metropolitan Manila is made up of 17 different cities, we had a project. They were paying their employees in cash. So we have a program through USAID in getting electronic payments to them, which cuts down all kinds of opportunities for paybacks and corruption. So those are the kinds of things. But central to what's going on in the Philippines is what the government is trying to do, much more so than, and we're pulling in the same direction, which is a good thing. It's not perfect. There are all kinds of different issues they have to deal with. But the Aquino government is trying to bring especially large corruption cases. 3 senators are currently in jail of 24. Actually, one just got out on bail. The former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court was impeached during the Aquino term. So there are high-level kinds of corruption cases that are used as symbolic examples of trying to bring about good governance. And the key issue, and this is a good thing also, for the campaign that's coming up is centered on corruption issues and whether the government will continue to be one led by anti-corruption forces or perhaps people who would be more transactional in their politics.
Briefly, the work that we're doing on rule of law, I think, will be helpful to the Vietnamese who also, alas, suffer from the challenge of corruption. And TPP, I think, when completed, TPP is going to be an important tool because TPP insists on transparency where in many cases transparency does not exist. And the Vietnamese are also increasingly looking at how we've set up an independent judiciary and how it works because they're trying to establish a judiciary that is not just captive of the party but that actually is able to exercise some influence.
I don't want to be a spoiler, but I don't think there's much we can do about corruption. It's systemic, and the thing that helps corruption is if your GDP goes up, per capita income. If you're paying your police $2-3 a day, they cannot survive. If you're paying your civil service, people who stamp, make driver's license $2 or $3, it doesn't happen. So it's really economic growth that's going to end corruption.
Although even then,
Even then, there are issues, obviously. Yeah.
One of the things that, if I could just jump in here on an ASEAN basis, ASEAN is trying to deal with corruption across the region to the extent it can. So it's developed something called the ASEAN single window, which is really to attack corruption at one of the places where it's most prevalent, which is at the border or at customs. And as many of the ambassadors alluded to, what it does is take a paper system in 10 countries and makes it into a single electronic system that cuts down the opportunities for payments to be made or to be demanded at the customs border. So from a business point of view, hopefully this ASEAN single window will, in the coming years, allow for much less corruption at the border. The process of the way they're developing that is they're developing national single windows, which are electronic national customs systems, and they're going to link them all across ASEAN so that you can have one set of criteria and forms that you fill in for any of the 10 countries in ASEAN. So I think that's also a step forward in that respect. But a lot of U.S. companies, especially a lot of our technology companies, are playing a significant role in helping to reduce the opportunities for corruption.
Next question from Jeff Malhorn, who runs World Business Chicago here.
Thank you. First, just a comment and then a question for the whole panel. My comments to Ambassador Osius with Vietnam. My family and I spent 2 weeks just a few years ago traveling Vietnam north to south. Tremendous experience. Warm and welcoming people, all generations, all parts of the country. So a positive tourist experience, and want to help from a business perspective. For the panel, the infrastructure needs for the region, wide range. Chicago's blessed with some very top architecture, engineering, project management, infrastructure firms. What are we doing enough to help your countries, and what more can we do to help, educate our companies here in terms of the opportunities?
I think we're not doing enough. I was very happy to hear that Bechtel may be engaged in a port project in southern Vietnam, but that's the exception, not the rule. Very often it's Chinese, Japanese, and Korean companies that get in there first when it comes to at least the kind of infrastructure that involves bridges and roads and ports. And I think there are opportunities. I know when I was in Indonesia, we were looking at second-tier cities and where there are opportunities to be involved in infrastructure investment that really could make money. Can I just respond briefly to your comment, too? What is one of the things that's been most striking to me in Vietnam is the lack of bitterness anywhere. Stunning. It is stunning. It's quite stunning. When I almost 20 years ago biked from north to south in Vietnam, and I was in the demilitarized zone, former demilitarized zone, standing on a bridge, and I was looking out over a lot of ponds, and I asked a woman standing next to me in Vietnamese, what's with all these ponds? And she said, well, that's where the Americans dropped bombs, and they dropped many bombs on my village. And she talked about the number of members of her family who'd been killed. And I said, well, I have to tell you, I work for the US Embassy. I represent the American people. And she said, Hôm nay chúng ta chị em, which means it's a very familial language. We are now brother and sister. And that stays with me, that they could be so forgiving and so forward-looking, and that we could be so warmly embraced. And everywhere I have gone in Vietnam, we have been embraced with great warmth, great friendliness. It's really remarkable.
Anyone else on the infrastructure question?
Well,
On to the more cheerless topic of infrastructure. As you all know, infrastructure, there's gigantic needs in Indonesia. I guess I would differ maybe a little bit from some of the others in saying that I think American companies are right to be a little bit strategic in what they focus on, because infrastructure development is an incredibly complex and corrupt business in Indonesia. And so unless you're really there full time and are really working on it and know how to get the land and huge number of other permits, it's very, very difficult to build a port or a road or anything like that. And that's why the Japanese and the Koreans and the Chinese mostly are dominating that sector. I think there are two areas in Indonesia that are huge opportunities for American companies. One is in energy. Jokowi has a 35,000 megawatt electricity generation program. He wants to generate that much in terms of new power generation in the next 5 years. And so American companies of all kinds are involved. We've set up a power working group to help promote American companies. There are 52 American companies that are now involved. And again, we hope to start getting quite a number of projects out the door fairly quickly, even before President Obama receives President Jokowi at the end of October. But I think there's going to be continuing opportunities in that area across the entire range of power that you can think of. So IPPs, various kinds of power projects, remote grids, I mean, you name it, the Indonesians need it. And again, I think we bring enormous credibility and experience and high quality technology. So they very much welcome that. The other one is in aviation, where of course Boeing has been a longtime supplier of aircraft, but the full suite of aviation services are needed now because there's a very fast expanding aviation sector. You're building a huge number of new airports, but all of that infrastructure development requires again, all of these new services. And so again, we have an aviation working group that we've set up and a very large number of transportation opportunities for US companies. And again, we're moving out very, very smartly in that area. So, but of course, other ones, any of you are interested, we're of course ready to support you.
In the Philippines, they're going through a very large infrastructure improvement program through public-private partnerships. And there are lots of opportunities in roads, in light rail, in the airport, which is in bad need of further improvements. That is good news. The bad news is that the way the Philippine economy and economic laws through the Constitution are structured don't allow for foreign ownership or majority ownership in certain sectors. So you have to partner with locals. So all of these public-private partnerships are being dominated by the large business groups, oftentimes with foreign participation. But we haven't seen that yet from American companies. And one big initiative of Chicago's own Secretary of Commerce, Penny Pritzker, has been to sign a memorandum of understanding with the Philippines to make the whole process more transparent, to know what's out there, how it's being done. One of the problems that has developed because of the anti-corruption campaign is constant bidding and rebidding of the same projects, because there are all kinds of allegations that come up. And while that has a good aspect to it, meaning that corruption is becoming a much more sensitive issue, it also is holding things up somewhat too. But there are opportunities, but it requires a lot of legwork.
I'd just add that the plans for infrastructure are huge. Over $1 trillion is planned in infrastructure across Southeast Asia in the next 3 to 5 years. The reality is much of that needs to be financed externally. The reality is that you run into challenges, as both Ambassador Blake and Ambassador Goldberg have said. There are opportunities, and tremendous opportunities, but you've got to make sure that you pick your projects appropriately. And I hope that Chicago firms will look at that, because there is a need for great architecture and great design and great engineering.
Thank you. Next question is from Phil Levy, our Senior Fellow on the Global Economy, right here at the head table, please.
Well, thank you all. This is very interesting. I wanted to come back to the topic of TPP, which has already been raised in the Vietnamese context. A general invitation to say something more, but also a very specific question to Ambassador Yun on Malaysia, which is, this is not the first time we've tried a free trade agreement with Malaysia. We tried not that many years back, less than a decade ago, and those talks did not succeed. What's different now? Why should we expect this to work this time?
I think technically it didn't work last time because Malaysia has 3 ethnic groups: Malays, who are about 65%, Chinese, who are about 25%, Indians, who are 10%. Now, Chinese have traditionally dominated commerce. And so in order to correct for that or to rectify that, because the government is largely controlled by Malays, they give Malays preference. It's called Bumiputra preference policy. And our last bilateral FTA got stuck because we were not flexible on Bumiputra preference policy. This time, they're willing to be flexible on that. So there is much more negotiation going on Bumiputra policy issues. So in other words, they're showing more flexibility where they had not shown before. So that's one reason why it's working. Second is more strategic. Again, as previous people have alluded to, China has made enormous headway into all of Southeast Asia since 10 years ago when we tried to do TPP, tried to do a bilateral FTA. I think there is a realization in Malaysia that they cannot be so dependent on China, and so it's really looking for another option.
Great. Next.
Maybe if I just,
Yes, of course.
one item on Vietnam. The Doi Mai, the restructuring, renovation reforms of the late 1980s and early 1990s have sort of run out of steam. And so for the Vietnamese, knowing that additional reforms are needed, their political system will allow them to make those reforms if there's external pressure. So I like to think of it as like Japanese gaiatsu. If they're able to say, well, it's the Americans and the Canadians who made us cut off these SOEs, these debt-laden, inefficient SOEs, well, that's what we've got to do. And so for them, TPP allows them to do a lot of the things that they need to do anyway. They know they have to do anyway. And the benefits are enormous, not only in terms of boosting their GDP and their trade, but they know it'll also increase investment into Vietnam because it gives a sort of stamp, seal of approval. So they see tremendous advantages from being part of TPP. So they're willing to pay what for them will be a heavy price in terms of doing things that are very hard under their system, but they're determined to do it.
And we just hosted President Sang of Vietnam on Friday in New York, and he hammered home these points, and he brought a delegation of 100 businessmen, some of whom ran SOEs, and they were all committed to reforming this SOE process, which would have been very hard just 3 or 4 years ago.
Thanks. Next question from the audience. Yes, the lady right there, please, in the middle.
Thank you. If I can pick up on a few of the aspects that you've said, you probably tell by my accent I'm not an American. So I'd like to thank Fulbright for giving me this opportunity to come over today. And just picking up on the question on aviation. Obviously, ASEAN works on mutuality, so it's an agreement process, which is different to the European Union. And in some ways, that may be seen as a positive, but also potentially a negative. With regards to aviation, certainly the talks this year, they haven't made the progression that they wanted to internally with regards to establishing an open skies area. At the moment, most of your agreements with the United States and the ASEAN 10 member states at the moment is on bilateral arrangements. Do you see that we can potentially move forward under the existing agreements, or do you think that we would benefit, and certainly the United States would benefit from multinational agreements with ASEAN and the United States? So the question's 2 parts there. Do you see that as a negative? And also with regards to the framework of ASEAN, do you see that the fact that they haven't got the network in place, if you like, for taking this forward, some of these developments further forward, as the European Union has?
My understanding is ASEAN doesn't really want to move to EU-like system which is why, for example, one of the bigger airlines in Malaysia is AirAsia. It has AirAsia version of India, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand because of lack of multilateral. So for us, we try to do open skies bilaterally. I think doing open skies with ASEAN as a unit is decades off, I would imagine, you know?
Yeah, it seems like the majority of push, or the bigger push, is actually from AirAsia and Tony Fernandez, who's established what's a booming discount airline in Southeast Asia, and he would like to see open skies across ASEAN. There's a Lion Air, which Boeing had one of its largest, up until the Chinese came to town last week, had its largest commercial deal ever with. So there's a couple of sort of second tier, if I will, or not national carriers that would like to see more open skies into secondary cities, especially. From a U.S. perspective, U.S. carriers are actually, unfortunately, pulling back from travel to routes to Southeast Asia at the moment. We'd love to see them do more, but the reality is that they're doing less routes to Southeast Asia than they did even a year ago. So,
Thank you. Next question from the audience, please. Yes, right there, please. Thanks.
This is to the ambassador to Vietnam. Why there is no animosity from the Vietnamese towards the Americans?
I think the reason is we were only one of many wars. The Vietnamese fought the Chinese for about 2,000 years. In fact, all of their histories with all their heroes, with the exception of Ho Chi Minh and General Giap, are people who fought the Chinese. Every street in every city in Vietnam is named after somebody who fought the Chinese. And then they fought the French, and then they fought us, and then they fought the Cambodians, and then they fought the Chinese again. And the last war with the Chinese went from 79 to 91. So the first time they've really experienced peace, really almost ever in their history, began in 1991. And they are a remarkably forward-looking people. And the other thing is that we've been honest about the past. So in the area of dealing with accounting for those who were lost during the war, we've been very open with Vietnamese, and they've been very open with us. We've been cleaning up dioxin, Agent Orange, in the hot spots where it was left, and we've been cleaning up unexploded ordnance. And we've been very deliberate in addressing those legacy issues, which have allowed us to focus on the future instead of the past. They have a saying, President Sang is famous for it, which means close the door in the past and focus on the future. And that's what they do.
the other reason is that it's a very young country, and many, although
Yeah.
not Lady on the Bridge did obviously have that experience, but a lot of the people, a lot of the population, big portion of the population, don't have
Very
firsthand
young.
memories of the Americans, and they see so much of our culture pervades in Southeast Asia. I mean, it's in Vietnam. So I think that's helped as well. They look to us from a cultural point of view.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, that's all we have time for today, but please join me in thanking the four ambassadors and also Alex for their time, and UL and the ASEAN Business Council. Thank you very much. We're adjourned.